The stagecoach left her at the edge of Wolf Creek, with a trunk that held everything she still owned in the world, which was not much, and a black dress that had begun to brown at the hem from the dust of 3 states. Mercy Halloran stood in the road for a long moment after the wheels had moved on, listening to the sound of the prairie settle back to itself. A jay called once from a cottonwood. The wind moved through the grass, like a hand drawn slowly across a tabletop. She was 31 years old, a widow of 7 months, and she had come west because there was nothing east of her any longer but debt and a brother-in-law who had looked at her over his coffee cup in a way she did not intend to be looked at again. She had a letter in her pocket from a woman named Adeline Mott, who ran a boarding house, and had said in plain ink that there was work in Wolf Creek for any woman not afraid of it. Mercy was not afraid of work. She had been afraid of other things in her life. A husband who coughed blood into a rag for 2 years and would not stop pretending he might recover, a doctor's bill that arrived the week of the funeral, a winter ahead with no fuel laid in. But work she understood. Work was the one thing that had never lied to her. She lifted the trunk by its leather strap and began to walk toward the cluster of low buildings that called itself a town. A man on a porch watched her come. He did not stand. He did not nod. He watched the way a person watches weather, deciding whether to bring the washing in. Adeline Mott turned out to be a small woman with iron gray hair and hands that had done laundry for 40 years and showed every hour of it. She read Mercy's face in the doorway, took the trunk from her without being asked, and said, "You'll have the back room. Supper is at 6. I don't tolerate drink and I don't tolerate weeping after lights out. Cry in the daytime if you must." Mercy almost smiled. It was the first thing she had felt close to a smile in a long while. "I came for work," she said. "I know what you came for," Adeline said. "Everyone who gets off that coach came for work. Question is, what work you're fit for. Can you cook? Yes. Can you clean? Yes. Can you mind? Your own." Mercy considered this. "When it serves me," Adeline made a sound that might have been a laugh in a younger woman. "There's a rancher north of here, name of Emmett Bridger, needs a woman to keep his house. His last one married a cattle buyer and went to Denver. He's particular, and he's quiet, and he pays in coin, not credit. You want it. The job's yours by morning. Why are you giving it to me? Because you walked into my house standing straight, and you didn't ask for tea before you asked for work. Bridger doesn't need a girl. He needs a woman who's already been broken once and put herself back together. That's you, or I'm a poor judge." Mercy looked at her own hands. They were red at the knuckles, and the wedding band was still on the 4th finger of her left, though there was no longer anyone alive to whom it referred. "I'll take it," she said. The Bridger place sat 4 miles north of town, a low log house, and a string of outbuildings set against a rise of pale grass that ran on toward a line of dark hills. Mercy was driven out the next morning by a boy of about 14, who did not speak to her except to point at things. The creek crossing, the fence line, the place where a coyote had killed a calf last spring. When the wagon pulled up to the house, a tall man came out onto the porch and stood with one hand on the post. He was perhaps a few years older than her, and built like a man who had spent his life on horses and never apologized for it. He was not handsome, the way men in pictures were handsome. He was handsome the way a good axe was handsome. There was a tightness at the corner of his mouth that suggested he had not used it for smiling in a long time. His hair was dark, cut blunt, and his eyes when they found her were the color of weak tea, and tired. "Mrs. Halloran," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Bridger." He looked at her a beat longer than was comfortable, then at her trunk, then at the boy. "Take it to the back room, Jem." To Mercy, he said, "Adeline told you the terms." She did. "Housework, meals, laundry on Mondays. You don't go in the barn after dark. You don't go past the North Creek. Wages on the 1st of the month. Cash." "All right. Any questions?" She thought about it. Why not past the North Creek? Something moved in his face and was gone. Because I said not to. She held his eye. She did not mean to. She had intended to be quiet and obliging, and to keep her place, but something in the way he said it, not unkindly, just closed, made her chin lift. Then I won't, she said. But I'd thank you to say so as a request rather than an order, since I've not yet started the work. The boy froze on the steps. Emmett Bridger did not move for what felt like a long count. Then he said very quietly, "Fair enough, Mrs. Halloran, as a request. Thank you, Mr. Bridger." He turned and went into the house, and she followed. And that was how she came to live at the edge of the world with a man who did not know how to ask for anything. The first weeks were quiet. Mercy learned the house the way a horse learns a new pasture. By walking every inch of it, she learned that he took his coffee black and strong enough to stand a spoon in, that he was up before light, and gone before she had the stove warm, that he came in at dusk smelling of horses and sage, and did not speak at supper unless spoken to, and often not even then, that he kept a photograph face down in a drawer in the front room and she was not to touch it, which she did not, though she dusted around it with care. She learned the ranch had 30 horses, and perhaps 400 head of cattle, and 7 men who worked it, only one of whom, a Mexican named Tomas, with gray at his temples, would meet her eye when she brought coffee to the bunkhouse porch. The others took the cup and grunted, and that was their conversation. She learned that, on Sundays, he did not work, and he did not go to church, and he sat on the porch, with a book she could not see the title of, and read until the light was gone. She did not learn what was past the North Creek. But she thought about it. One evening, near the end of her 3rd week, a storm came in fast from the west. She was bringing in laundry from the line, hurrying, because the first fat drops had already started, when she saw him crossing the yard at a half-run with a saddlebag over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her, the rain catching them both at the same moment, and for a fraction of a second he looked at her, the way a man looks at something he had forgotten was there. Then he ducked his head and went into the barn, and she gathered the last of the sheets and ran for the house. Inside, she set the basket down and stood at the window watching the rain come down in sheets across the yard. The barn door was still open. He had not come out. After a few minutes, she put on her shawl and a wide-brimmed hat she had inherited from the previous housekeeper and went back out into the wet. She found him in the barn, standing beside a bay mare who was sweating and shifting and had clearly been ridden hard. He was running a hand down her foreleg, and his face was set in a way Mercy recognized, the face of a person trying very hard not to feel something. "She's lame," Mercy said. "I know. Front off. Right above the fetlock." He looked up. "You know horses. I know animals. My father had a stable in Pennsylvania before the war." He straightened slowly. The rain hammered the roof above them. "What would you do? Cold pack and rest. 2 weeks at least. And whoever wrote her like that ought to be ashamed." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "It was me. Then you ought to be ashamed." It was the wrong thing to say to her employer, and she knew it as it came out of her mouth, but she did not take it back. He looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. Then he gave a short nod and bent again to the mare's leg. "I'll get the cold water," he said. "I'll get the rags." They worked in silence for an hour, wrapping the leg, settling the mare, mucking out a clean stall. When it was done, he washed his hands at the trough by the door and said, without looking at her, "Thank you, Mrs. Halloran." "You're welcome, Mercy," he said, like he was testing the word. "If you'll allow it." "I'll allow it." "All right, Emmett." He went out into the rain and crossed to the house, and she stood a moment in the barn, listening to the mare breathe, and she felt something in her chest she had not felt since before her husband had started coughing. It was not happiness. It was not even close. It was the smaller thing that comes before happiness, the thing that says it might still be possible. Us. The next morning at breakfast, he set down his coffee cup and said, "There's been talk in town." "About what?" "About you being out here." Mercy set down the pan she had been scrubbing. "What kind of talk?" "The kind women make when they've nothing better." Adeline sent word. "There's a woman called Honora Pell who's taken an interest in your situation. She is the wife of the cattle agent. She is also, as it happens, the sister of the woman I was going to marry." Before the influenza took her in '68, Mercy was quiet. "I tell you this," he said, "because Honora has decided that no woman should live in this house unless she is married to the man who owns it. She has decided this loudly and she has friends." "I see. I can send you back to town if you want." Mercy thought about it. She thought about it for what she considered an honest length of time. Then she said, "I am not going back to town because a woman I have never met has an opinion about where I sleep. If you want me gone, send me. If you don't, I'll thank you to pour your own coffee in the mornings because I'll be busy." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Busy with what?" "With the work you're paying me for." A muscle moved in his jaw. It might have been the beginning of a smile. He did not let it become one. "All right," he said. "Stay." She did stay. And she began, without announcing it to anyone, including herself, to walk. It started because she could not sleep. The house at night was full of small sounds: the timber settling, the wind under the eaves, an owl on the ridge, and she would lie in the narrow bed in the back room and listen to them until her mind went round and round on the same worn track. Her husband's last week, the auctioneer at the door, the brother-in-law's hand on her wrist. So she began to get up before light and walk. At first, she walked only the yard, the kitchen garden, the path to the spring house. Then she went further. The cattle pens, the hay barn, the track that led south to the road. She would walk until the dawn began to gray the eastern sky, and then she would come in and start the stove and put the coffee on, and Emmett would come down to find it already made and look at her with a question in his face that he did not ask. She began to know the ranch the way she had learned the house. She learned where the wind cut through and where it did not. She learned which gate latched true and which had to be lifted. She learned the smell of the creek at 4 in the morning, and the way the cattle bunched in the lower pasture when a cougar was somewhere on the hills. One morning in her 5th week, she walked further than she had ever walked. She walked the eastern fence and then turned north, because the north pasture was where the main herd had been moved for the late summer grass, and because she had heard Thomas say at the bunkhouse 2 days before that the line wanted riding and there was no one to ride it for another week. She did not mean to go past the North Creek. She remembered the rule. But the fence ran along the creek for a long way and then bent away from it, and following the fence took her where the creek did not. And by the time she realized she had crossed the boundary in spirit, if not in fact, the sun was up and she was alone on a long, slow rise of grass with the fence on her right and 400 head of cattle somewhere ahead. She kept walking. Something in her would not let her turn back. There was a thing about walking a fence line that she had learned as a girl from her father. You walked it, because the fence could not tell you when it had failed. You had to look. And as she walked, she began to feel a small unease that grew with every quarter mile, because the fence on her right was old in places, and the posts leaned, and the wire sagged where the staples had pulled, and no one had ridden this line in a long time. She came around a low shoulder of land and stopped. 40 feet of fence was down. Not cut, not broken by weather, pushed. The posts lay flat, and the wire was coiled and tangled in the grass like a snake that had died fighting, and on the far side of the gap the ground was churned with the prints of something heavy that had come through and then gone back. And she knew before she had finished looking that the something was the herd. Not all of it, not yet. The main body of cattle was still on the wrong side of the rise, grazing peacefully, unaware. But 12 or 15 had drifted through the gap in the dark, and their tracks led off to the northeast into country she had never seen. country that ran toward the hills and toward whatever it was that Emmett Bridger did not want her to know about. She stood in the gap and made herself think, if she went back for help, the rest of the herd would smell the gap and come through. Cattle were stupid and curious in equal measure, and once one went, the others would follow, and 400 head would be scattered across 10 miles of broken country by noon, and it would take a month to gather them, and some would not be gathered at all. If she stayed, she could turn them. Cattle could be turned by a single person with patience and the right angle. If they had not yet decided to move, she had done it as a girl with her father's milkers. She had never done it with longhorn beef, but the principle was the same. She set down her shawl on a fence post as a marker, and she began to walk, slow and steady, around the lower side of the herd, putting herself between them and the gap. Her heart was loud in her ears. The cattle lifted their heads as she came. A big red cow watched her with an expression that was not friendly. Mercy did not look at her directly. She walked. When she had got herself into the position she wanted, she began to move them. Not by shouting, by presence, by stepping forward when they drifted toward the gap and stepping back when they drifted away. She moved with the slowness of a person trying not to wake a child. The herd shifted, milled, complained. A bull bellowed once, and her stomach turned to water, but he did not come at her. Slowly, slowly, she walked them west, away from the gap, toward the safer pasture by the spring. It took an hour, maybe more. The sun was high by the time she had them where she wanted them, and her dress was wet through with sweat, and the hem was caked with mud, and she could feel her own pulse in her wrists. But the herd was contained. And the gap was still empty. She did not go back to the house. She picked up her shawl and she walked the fence the rest of the way, both directions from the gap, until she had counted 7 other places where the wire was thin or a post was leaning, and she fixed the worst of them with her hands, and a length of baling wire she found tangled in the grass. Then she began the walk back. She was perhaps a mile from the house when she heard hooves. Emmett came over the rise at a gallop, and pulled up so hard the horse skidded in the grass. His face was the color of ash. "Where in God's name have you been? Walking your fence. Tomei said you weren't in the kitchen. Jem said your shawl was gone. I thought." He stopped. His hand was tight on the reins. The horse blew through its nose and stamped. "I thought," he said again, and then he did not finish. "There's a gap," she said. "North line, just past the bend, 40 feet down. 15 or so came through in the night and went toward the hills. The rest I've moved to the spring pasture. The fence wants riding the full length. There are 7 other places that won't hold a season." He stared at her. He stared at her for a long time. Then he swung down off the horse and stood in front of her, in the grass. And he said, "You walked the north fence by yourself on foot." "Past the creek?" "Yes. I told you not to." "You did. Why?" Mercy looked up at him. She was tired. Her dress was filthy. She had cattle dung on her boot. She said, "Because somebody had to, and there was no one else to do it, and I would rather be turned out for disobeying than stand in your kitchen knowing your herd was scattering, and I had not warned you." Emmett Bridger closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a count of perhaps 3. Then he opened them, and he said, in a voice she had never heard from him, "Get up on the horse. I'll walk. I can walk. Get up on the horse, Mercy." He led it by the bridle, walking beside her in the grass, neither of them speaking, all the way back to the house. That evening, Thomas and 2 other men rode out to the north line with rolls of new wire and lanterns, and they worked until dark. Emmett rode with them. He came in past midnight smelling of sweat and iron and grass, and he found her sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and a cup of cold coffee in her hand because she had not been able to sleep. He did not sit down. He stood in the doorway and he said, "The 15 head were on a draw. 2 miles in, we brought them home. The fence is closed. Good. I told you not to go past the creek because there is a piece of ground out there. I do not go on." My brother is buried on it. He was killed by a man named Hollis Pell over a card game and a horse. And I did not avenge him because the law said I was not to. And I have not crossed onto that ground in 9 years. Because if I do, I will go into town and finish what I should have finished then. That is why I told you not to go. Mercy set down her cup. Hollis Pell, she said. Honora Pell's husband. Her husband. Yes. And he is still here. He is still here. She sat for a moment with a lamp between them. Then she said, Emmett, sit down. He sat down. He sat down. He sat down like a man whose strings had been cut. He put his hands flat on the table, and he looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. I am sorry about your brother, she said. I am sorry you have carried that. I will not walk on that ground. But I will walk your fences as long as I am here. Because they need walking, and I am here. He did not answer. He did not look up. After a long moment she reached across the table and put her hand on his. He did not move under it. She did not move it. They sat that way for what might have been a minute, or might have been 5, and then he turned his hand over slowly under hers and folded his fingers around her palm, and that was all that happened. But she felt the whole of him in it. The grief and the rage and the long shut door of him. And she felt him asking without words whether she would stay. I'll stay, she said. He nodded once. He let go of her hand. He stood up and went up the stairs to his room, and she heard the door close, and she sat at the table for a long time after, with the lamp burning low. Word of what she had done went around the bunkhouse within a day and into Wolf Creek within 3. Tomas told it once plainly, to the man who delivered the salt blocks, and from there it walked into town on its own legs. The widow Halloran had walked the north fence by herself and turned the Bridger herd back from a gap that would have scattered 400 head, and she had done it on foot, in a dress, before breakfast. Some of the women in town did not like the story. Honora Pell did not like it at all. Honora Pell did not like it at all. She was a tall, handsome woman of 40 with pale eyes and a way of holding her chin that made people put down their forks when she came into the dining room. She had decided some months earlier that Emmett Bridger was a widower of a sort, marriageable in the right circumstances, and that the right circumstances did not include a woman from Pennsylvania living under his roof. The next Sunday, Mercy went into town with Adeline, for the first time since she had taken the position. She did not have to go. Adeline had asked her to come for a visit, and Mercy had said yes, because she had begun to understand that if she did not show her face in Wolf Creek, the story about her would grow legs she did not want it to have. Honora Pell was waiting in the dry goods store, not by chance. She turned from the counter as Mercy came in, and she said, loud enough for the 3 other women in the store to hear, "There she is, the one who walks where she is not asked." Mercy did not stop walking. She went to the counter and asked for the thread Adeline had sent her for. The clerk was a young man, and he looked at his hands. "I am speaking to you," Honora said. Mercy turned. She had decided on the walk into town what she would do if this happened, and she did it now. "Mrs. Pell," she said, "I have not had the pleasure. I know who you are." "Then you have the advantage. I know you live alone with a man who is not your husband, and I know what kind of woman does that." Mercy felt the room go very still. Adeline, by the door, did not move. The clerk had become a statue. Outside, a wagon rolled past, and the sound of it was very loud. "Mrs. Pell," Mercy said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by that. "I am a widow of 7 months. I lost my husband to consumption after nursing him 2 years. I came west because there was no work for me at home, and a brother-in-law I did not care to live near. I keep house for Mr. Bridger in exchange for wages I have earned twice over. I sleep in the back room alone, and I lock the door from the inside, though I have never had cause to. I do not know what kind of woman you think I am, but I will tell you what kind of woman I am not. I am not the kind who is frightened by another woman in a store. Honora's face had gone a color that did not become her. You think you are very clever. No, I think I am very tired. Good day, Mrs. Pell. She paid for the thread, and she walked out, and Adeline followed her, and they got into the wagon, and Adeline did not speak until they were past the last building of the town. Then she said, "Mercy Halloran." That was not the speech of a woman who came west to hide. "I was not hiding," Mercy said. "I was waiting." "For what?" Mercy looked out across the grass. "I'm not sure yet." She found out a week later it was a Wednesday. She was in the kitchen garden pulling carrots when she heard the horses come into the yard. 3 of them, and she stood up. Because 3 horses at midday was wrong. Emmett was on the South Range. Tomas was with him. The only man at the house should have been Jem, and Jem was 12 years old, and not a man yet. She came around the corner of the house with the carrots still in her hand, and she saw Hollis Pell on a gray gelding with 2 other men behind him. She did not know. Pell was a heavy man, with a thick neck, and the kind of mustache a man grows when he has decided he is important. He was wearing a sidearm. "Mrs. Halloran," he said. "Mr. Pell, you know who I am. I have a fair guess," he smiled. "It was not pleasant. I've come on a small matter of business. There's a question of title on the north quarter of this ranch. My office has reason to believe Bridger does not hold clear papers on the section above the creek. I've come to serve notice." Mercy felt the cold of it go down her spine, and then she felt something else, something her father used to call the still place, the place a person went when fear could not help them any longer. She set down the carrots on the porch step. She wiped her hands on her apron. She said, "Mr. Bridger is not at home. You may leave the notice with me, and I will see he gets it. I'd rather wait. I would rather you did not." One of the men behind Pell laughed. Pell did not. He swung down from his horse, slow and deliberate, and he came up onto the porch, and he stood over her, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on him, though it was not yet 2 in the afternoon. "Mrs. Halloran," he said very low, "you should understand something. The talk in town about you is one thing. The talk about Bridger is another. He has not been a friend to my family. There are easier ways to settle a thing than papers and a judge. You might tell him that. You might tell him a woman in his house does not make him stronger, it makes him slower." Mercy looked up at him. He was a head taller than her, and twice her weight, and he had a gun on his hip. She said very quietly, "Mr. Pell, you are standing on the porch of a house where I work. I am asking you to leave it. If you do not, I will go inside, and I will come back out with the rifle that is over the door, and I have not fired one since I was 16 years old. But the distance from here to your chest is not great enough for that to matter." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long count. Then he stepped back. He stepped back off the porch, and he mounted his horse, and he said, "Tell him I will." They rode out. She stood on the porch until they were past the gate, and then she sat down very suddenly on the step beside the carrots, and she put her face in her hands, and she shook for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she got up, and she went inside, and she took the rifle down from over the door, and she checked that it was loaded. And she put it on the kitchen table where she could see it from the stove, and she went back out and finished pulling the carrots because the supper still had to be made. Emmett came in at dusk. She told him at the table plainly what had happened and what had been said. He did not eat. He listened. When she had finished, he stood up and walked out of the room, and she heard him in the front room opening the drawer where the photograph was, and then closing it, and then he came back, and he sat down again. "He has no papers," he said. "The north quarter is mine clean. My father filed it in '59. The deed is in the bank in Cheyenne." "Then why?" "Because he is not after the land. He is after me. He has been after me since I did not call him out 9 years ago. He thinks I am a coward. He thinks if he pushes hard enough, I will come for him at last, and he will be ready. He has been waiting for an excuse, and now I am the excuse. Now you are the excuse." She was quiet. She turned the cup in her hands. She said, "Emmett, I will leave if you tell me to. I will go back to town tonight if it keeps a bullet out of you." He looked at her across the table and he said, "Mercy Halloran, if you go back to town tonight to keep a bullet out of me, I will follow you in the morning and bring you back, and I will do it in front of every soul in Wolf Creek, because I have been a man without a reason to walk into that town for 9 years and I have one now, and I will not give it up because Hollis Pell raised his voice on my porch." She did not answer for a long time. Then she said, "All right, all right. What do we do?" He looked at the rifle on the table. "We ride to Cheyenne in the morning, and we bring back the deed. And then we go into Wolf Creek together, and we put it on the agent's counter, in front of the whole town. And we let Hollis Pell see that I am not coming for him with a gun. I am coming for him with a paper. And then I expect he will come for me, and we will have to be ready. I will be ready. I know you will." They left before light. Cheyenne was 2 days' ride, one to get there and one back, and they took the wagon because the deed was not the only thing he meant to bring home. They rode in silence for the first hour, and then he began, slowly, to talk. He told her about his brother. He told her about the woman he had been going to marry, and how she had died in 2 days of fever, and how he had sat with her and held her hand and felt her go cold. He told her about his father, who had built the ranch from nothing and died of a heart attack on horseback at the age of 58, and how Emmett had been 21 and not ready, and had become ready anyway because there was no choice. He talked the way a man talks who has not talked in a long time, in fits with long pauses, looking at the horizon and not at her. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, she told him about her husband, about the long, slow dying, about the bills, about the brother-in-law. She told him she had not cried at the funeral because by then she had been too tired, and she had cried later in the kitchen, alone over a kettle, and that had been the last time, because crying had not helped. "It might help now," he said. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe later." They got to Cheyenne by dusk, and they slept in separate rooms at a boarding house, and in the morning they went to the bank, and the deed was where it was supposed to be. They camped one night on the open prairie under a sky so full of stars she could not have counted them in a year. He laid out a bedroll for her by the fire and his own across from it, and he sat up with the rifle across his knees and watched the dark, and she fell asleep watching the side of his face in the firelight and woke once in the night to find he had put his coat over her. They came into Wolf Creek on the third afternoon, and they went straight to the office of the land agent, and Emmett laid the deed on the counter in front of the man, and the agent read it twice and looked up and said, "There is no question on this title, Mr. Bridger." "I am sorry you were told there was. Who told you to send Pell?" The agent looked at his hands. "Mr. Pell told me there was a complaint." "There was no complaint." "No?" "Then there is no complaint." Emmett picked up the deed and folded it and put it inside his coat. He turned to leave. Mercy was already at the door. She had her hand on it when she heard the Boothiels on the boardwalk outside, and she knew before she opened the door who it would be. Hollis Pell was standing in the street with his hand on his sidearm, and Honora was behind him on the boardwalk with her face white as paper, and there were perhaps 20 people in the street now, because in a town the size of Wolf Creek, 20 people gather for anything. "Bridger," Pell said. "Pell, you came back. I came back. You brought your woman. I brought Mrs. Halloran, whom I intend to marry if she will have me, and who is not a thing I bring." Mercy felt it go into her like a struck note, and she did not move, because if she moved, she would fall. "Then I am calling you out," Pell said, "for my wife's sister, for the insult to my house, right here." Emmett stepped down off the boardwalk into the street. He did not have a gun on his hip, He had not worn one in 9 years. Mercy saw Tomas at the end of the street, and she saw Adeline in the doorway of the boarding house, and she saw the sheriff, a man named Webb, standing on the porch of his office with his hand on his own gun, and a face that said he had been waiting for this day and was not happy it had come. "I am not going to shoot you, Hollis," Emmett said. "I have not been going to shoot you for 9 years. I have wanted to. There is not a morning of those 9 years I have not wanted to. But my brother is dead, and shooting you does not unbury him, and I have something. Now I did not have then, and I am not going to throw it into the street for you. You are a coward. I am, whatever you need to call me." Pell's hand tightened on the sidearm, and Mercy saw it tighten, and she stepped down off the boardwalk into the street behind Emmett, and she said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "Mr. Pell, if you draw that gun, you will be shot before it clears the holster. Not by him, by me. I am standing 6 feet behind him, with my hand inside my shawl, and there's a derringer in it that was my husband's, and I have practiced with it every Sunday afternoon for 2 months in the back pasture. And at this distance, the street went perfectly quiet. It was not true about the derringer. She had no derringer. She had a folded handkerchief in her hand under the shawl. But she said it like it was true, and she meant it like it was true, and Hollis Pell looked past Emmett at her face, and he saw something in it that made him take his hand off the sidearm. "Sheriff," Mercy said without turning. "Are you watching this?" "I am watching it. Mrs. Halloran, Mr. Pell came to the Bridger Ranch last week and threatened me on the porch, in the presence of a 12-year-old boy. He has lied to the land office about a complaint that did not exist. He has called out an unarmed man in the street. Are these things you take an interest in?" A pause. Then Sheriff Webb said, "They are, Mrs. Halloran. They surely are. Hollis, step away from that gun and walk over here." Pell did not move for a long count. He looked at Emmett. He looked at Mercy. He looked at his wife, who was no longer behind him, who had stepped back into the doorway of the dry goods store with her hand over her mouth. And then he took his hand off the sidearm, and he walked, slow and stiff, across the street to the sheriff's porch. And the sheriff took the gun from his belt, and the moment was over. Mercy did not realize she was shaking until Emmett turned and put his hands on her shoulders. He looked at her face, and he said, very quietly, "There is no derringer, is there?" "No, Mercy, I know. You stood in the street behind me, and you bluffed Hollis Pell with a handkerchief." "I did," he laughed. It was a short, startled sound, and she did not think he had made it in years. He laughed, and then he pulled her against him there in the dust of the main street of Wolf Creek, with half the town watching, and he held her, and she felt the whole length of him shaking, too, and she understood then what she had not understood before, which was that he had been as frightened as she had been, and braver than she had known. And she put her arms around his back and held on. They were married 3 weeks later in the front room of the Bridger Ranch house, by a circuit preacher who had ridden in for the occasion. Adeline stood up with Mercy. Tomas stood up with Emmett. Jem, scrubbed pink and miserable in a borrowed collar, held the ring on a square of clean linen and did not drop it. There were perhaps 15 people in the room. Honora Pell was not one of them. She had left for her sisters in St. Louis the week after the business in the street, and the talk in town was that she would not be coming back, and the talk turned out to be right. Hollis Pell was held in the sheriff's jail for 9 days on a charge of fraud against the land office and a second charge of threatening a woman in her place of employment, and he paid the fine, and he left for Texas the morning he was released, and the talk in town was that he would not be coming back either, and the talk was right about that too. The land agent kept his job, but only just, and only after he came out to the ranch with his hat in his hand and apologized to Mercy in person, which she accepted, because she had decided that she was going to be a woman who accepted apologies when they were honest, because the alternative was to carry every wrong forever, and she had carried enough. Adeline came out for supper once a month and stayed 2 nights and slept in the back room that had been Mercy's, and on the second morning of every visit she sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and said something cutting and true about somebody in town, and Mercy laughed, and Emmett, who had begun to laugh more often than he had in any of the last 9 years, laughed too. The north fence was rebuilt that autumn from end to end, and Mercy rode it with Emmett every Sunday morning that the weather allowed on a small chestnut mare he had bought her in Cheyenne, and which she had named Pennsylvania because she said the mare was as stubborn as everyone she had grown up with. The cattle did not get out again. The gap that had been a gap was now the strongest stretch of fence on the ranch, because Emmett had rebuilt it himself, alone, in the week after the wedding, and he had told her when he came in on the last evening of that week that he had finally walked on the piece of ground where his brother was buried, and he had sat there a long time, and he thought it had done him good. She did not ask him what he had said to his brother, that was between them. One evening late in October, with the cottonwoods gone gold along the creek and the wind cold enough to want a shawl, Mercy stood on the porch and watched Emmett come up from the barn in the long blue light. He saw her and lifted a hand. She lifted hers back. He came up the steps and he stopped beside her, and he put his hand on the small of her back, the way he had begun to, without thinking about it, and they stood that way, looking at the grass and the hills beyond it, and neither of them said anything for a while. "I walked your fence today," she said eventually. "I know you did. It held, I know it did." He turned her toward him, and he kissed her, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that was not asking a question, because the question had already been answered. Then he tucked her under his arm, and they went inside out of the wind, and the porch light burned on behind them in the gathering dark. And somewhere on the ridge a coyote called once, and was answered, and the prairie settled, as it always did, into the long quiet of a frontier evening, with a woman who had walked where she was not asked, and a man who had finally been asked for what he could not say, both of them home at last.